Get your muddy hands off my counter before you stain something valuable.
Call the issuing bank and verify the check.
Verify what? A farmer dressed like that with $2 million?
That check is real, Mr. Voss. Pick up the phone and verify it before this goes any further.
You don't belong in this bank, and you sure don't belong near that kind of money.
Graham's face tightened. He lifted the cashier's check high enough for the whole lobby to see, tore it in half, and dropped the pieces on the counter. Caleb didn't reach for them. He didn't raise his voice. Customers stared as Graham pointed toward the glass doors and ordered security to block the exit. Graham Voss had no idea he had just humiliated the man who owned 40% of the bank. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The glass doors of First National Bank swung open with a soft whoosh as Caleb Monroe stepped inside, his worn leather boots squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. The afternoon sun filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the pristine lobby. Everything here gleamed: chrome fixtures, spotless counters, and leather chairs arranged perfectly around glass tables covered with financial brochures nobody ever read. Caleb removed his straw hat as he walked, revealing gray hair pressed down from hours of morning fieldwork. His red flannel shirt had faded from countless washings, the sleeves rolled up to show forearms weathered by decades under the sun. Mud clung to the edges of his boots, despite his attempt to scrape them clean on the mat outside. The bank hummed with quiet efficiency. A few customers sat at desks, signing papers with polished advisors. Two women waited in line ahead of him, whispering about mortgage rates. Behind the counter, tellers moved with practiced precision, counting money and stamping documents. Caleb joined the line, patient as always. He pulled a folded envelope from his shirt pocket and checked inside one more time. The cashier's check was still there, crisp and official, with numbers that would make most people's hands shake. $2 million. The sale of Ruth's father's old timber tract, land nobody thought was worth much, until the developers came sniffing around. When his turn came, he approached the counter where a young woman with kind eyes and nervous hands waited behind the glass partition. Her nameplate read Lillian Brooks. She looked maybe 30, wearing a navy blazer that seemed too formal for her gentle face. "Good afternoon," Caleb said, his voice quiet and respectful. "I'd like to make a deposit to the Monroe Family Farms business account, please." Lillian smiled. "Of course, Mr. Monroe. What type of deposit are we making today?" Caleb slid the check through the slot beneath the glass. "Cashier's check." Lillian's eyes moved to the paper, and Caleb watched her expression change. Her smile faltered, her eyebrows lifted. She picked up the check, turned it over, then looked at it again, like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. She said, glancing toward the back offices. This is quite a large amount. I need to get my manager to help with this transaction." "That's fine," Caleb said. "Take your time." Lillian hurried away from the counter, her heels clicking rapidly across the floor. Caleb could hear her speaking in urgent whispers to someone in the back. Other customers in line began shifting, checking their watches, looking around with mild irritation. Within 2 minutes, a man in a sharp black suit emerged from the manager's office. Graham Voss was younger than Caleb expected, maybe mid-40s, with perfectly styled hair and a tie that probably cost more than Caleb's entire outfit. His face carried the expression of someone permanently annoyed by interruption. Graham's eyes swept over Caleb from hat to boots, lingering on the mud stains and worn fabric. His mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. He approached the counter with the check in his hand, holding it like it might contaminate his manicured fingers. "Sir," Graham said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. Several customers turned to look. "I'm Graham Voss, branch manager. My teller tells me you're trying to deposit this check." "That's right," Caleb said evenly. "Into my business account." Graham held the check up to the light, studying it with theatrical skepticism. $2 million? he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's quite a sum for—" He paused, looking Caleb up and down again. "Well, for someone in your line of work?" A flush of heat crept up Caleb's neck, but his voice remained calm. "Farming pays better than some people think. Does it now?" Graham's smile was sharp and cold. "Because, honestly, sir, looking at this document and looking at you, I'm thinking you might have picked the wrong bank to try this little scheme." The lobby went completely silent. An elderly woman at a nearby desk stopped writing. The two ladies in line turned to stare openly. Even the other tellers had stopped their work to watch the confrontation unfold. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his hand steady on the counter. "There's no scheme here, Mr. Voss. That's a legitimate cashier's check from First Southern Trust. You can verify it with a simple phone call." "Can I?" Graham's voice dripped with false concern. "You know what I think? I think you found this somewhere, or maybe someone paid you to walk in here and try to cash it. Either way, I'm not about to let you commit fraud in my bank." "Sir," Caleb said, his patience wearing thin but his voice still controlled, "I'm asking you to do your job. Verify the check through the issuing bank. It'll take 5 minutes." Graham shook his head slowly, enjoying the moment. "I don't need to make any phone calls. I can spot a fake from across the room." He held the check higher, waving it slightly so everyone could see. "This check is fake." The silence in the lobby stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Every eye in the room fixed on the confrontation at the main counter. Graham Voss held the check high, his voice echoing off the polished marble walls and gleaming surfaces. "Derek!" Graham called sharply toward the back of the bank. "Get over here." A tall man in a Navy security uniform emerged from near the offices. Derek Hale was older than most security guards, maybe 50, with graying hair and the careful posture of someone who had spent years in law enforcement. His face showed no emotion as he walked across the lobby, but his eyes moved between Graham and Caleb, taking in the scene. "Stand by the doors," Graham ordered without looking at him. "Make sure our friend here doesn't leave until we sort this out." Derek positioned himself near the entrance, his hands clasped behind his back. He said nothing, but Caleb could feel the weight of being watched, trapped between the counter and the exit. Caleb kept his hands flat on the marble surface, making sure everyone could see them clearly. "Mr. Voss, I'd like my check back, please." Graham laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the tension. "Your check? This piece of garbage?" He waved it dismissively. "You walk into my bank looking like you just crawled out of a cornfield, tracking mud on my floors, and you expect me to believe you're carrying around $2 million? Heat rose in Caleb's chest, but his voice remained steady. "What I look like doesn't change what that check is, doesn't it?" Graham stepped closer to the counter, his eyes bright with cruel amusement. "Because I see a man in dirty work clothes trying to pass off fake paper to hard-working people. I see someone who thinks he can waltz in here and make fools of my staff." Near the customer service desk, Evelyn Price sat quietly in a padded chair, filling out a deposit slip. She was a dignified woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back neatly and a cardigan buttoned over a simple dress. As Graham's voice grew louder and more aggressive, she glanced up from her paperwork. Her expression hardened as she watched the scene unfold. Slowly, carefully, Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She held it low, angled toward the counter, and pressed record. The small screen captured Graham pointing at Caleb while other customers stared and whispered. "You're disturbing real customers," Graham continued, gesturing toward the people in line. "Honest folks who work for their money and don't try to scam their way into wealth." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. A middle-aged man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably in line. The elderly woman at the desk clutched her purse tighter. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Caleb's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his words were calm and deliberate. "Humiliating a customer in public doesn't make that check fake, Mr. Voss. It just makes you look unprofessional." Graham's face darkened. "Unprofessional? You think I'm being unprofessional?" He leaned forward across the counter, bringing his face closer to Caleb's. "You walk into my bank trying to embarrass me and my staff with this pathetic con job? And you want to lecture me about professionalism? I want you to do your job, Caleb said quietly. Call your regional office. Call the issuing bank. Verify the check properly instead of making assumptions. I don't need to call anyone. Graham's voice cracked like a whip. His composure was slipping, replaced by raw contempt. I can spot trash when I see it, whether it's fake checks or the people trying to pass them off. The insult hit the room like a physical blow. Several customers gasped audibly. Evelyn's grip tightened on her phone, making sure she captured every word. Even Derek shifted uncomfortably by the door, his professional mask showing cracks of concern. Graham straightened up, his face flushed with anger and authority. He gripped the check with both hands, his knuckles white against the paper. You want to know what I think of your little scheme? Before anyone could respond, Graham yanked his hands apart. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the silent lobby like a gunshot. The $2 million cashier's check ripped cleanly in half, the pieces fluttering down to land on the marble counter between them. Graham's chest rose and fell rapidly as he glared at Caleb. He pointed one trembling finger toward the glass doors at the front of the bank. Get out of my bank. The torn pieces of the cashier's check lay on the marble counter like shattered glass. Caleb stared down at them, his weathered hands still resting on the edge of the surface. For a moment, the entire bank seemed suspended in silence, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Graham's face was bright red, his chest heaving with righteous anger. He turned toward the security chief standing near the entrance. Derek, don't let him leave. I want this man detained until the police get here. Derek Hale shifted his weight, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. The former police officer had worked bank security for 3 years, but something about this situation felt different, wrong. Still, Graham was his boss, and the paycheck depended on following orders. Sir? You heard me, Graham snapped. This man just attempted to pass a fraudulent instrument worth $2 million. That's a felony. Keep him here. Whispers rippled through the lobby like water through stones. The businessman in the expensive suit leaned toward the woman behind him, speaking in hushed tones. Near the information desk, an elderly couple exchanged worried glances before quickly looking away, as if eye contact might somehow make them complicit in whatever was happening. But not everyone turned away. A young mother with a toddler in her arms watched with wide eyes, her expression caught between fascination and horror. 2 college-aged women by the ATM machines held their phones up, recording everything. This was the kind of drama that would be all over social media within the hour. Caleb's initial surprise faded slowly, replaced by something cooler and more focused. His eyes moved from the torn check to Graham's flushed face, studying the bank manager with the kind of patience that came from years of watching crops grow and weather change. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and deliberate. Put that accusation in writing. Graham blinked. What? You're claiming I tried to commit fraud. You've destroyed what you say is evidence. Put your accusation in writing, with your signature and the date. Graham laughed, but the sound was sharper now, less confident. You should be worried about jail time, not paperwork, old man. You think anyone's going to believe your sob story once the cops get here? Behind the counter, Lillian Brooks watched the confrontation with growing unease. The young teller had been working at First National for 2 years, long enough to know that Graham could be cruel when he felt threatened. But something about this felt bigger than a routine customer dispute. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled up the account system on her computer terminal. Monroe Family Farms. The name was familiar, though she couldn't place why. Lillian scrolled through the business account details, her eyes widening as she saw the deposit history, the balance, the account status. Then she saw something that made her stomach drop, a note in the confidential section, visible only to senior staff, about ownership structures and board relationships. Her breath caught. With shaking fingers, she opened her secure messaging system and typed quickly. Marianne, urgent situation in lobby with account holder Caleb Monroe. Manager Graham involved. Please advise immediately. Near the customer service area, Evelyn Price continued holding her phone steady, making sure she captured every word of Graham's threats. She had been a school principal for 30 years before retiring, long enough to recognize a bully when she saw one. The way Graham stood over Caleb, the way he used his authority to humiliate someone he perceived as vulnerable, it was textbook intimidation. Graham paced behind the counter, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "You know what's going to happen now? I'm closing all your accounts, every single one, and you're banned from this branch permanently. You'll have to drive 50 miles to the next town if you want to bank anywhere in this system." Caleb watched him pace, his expression unchanged. "The check you tore up was a verified cashier's check from Farmers Trust Bank, serial number 28479183. You can verify that with one phone call. I don't care if it came from the Federal Reserve." Graham spun around, pointing an accusatory finger. "You don't dress like someone who has that kind of money. You don't talk like someone who belongs in here. And you sure don't. You just destroyed property tied to a verified cashier's check." Caleb interrupted, his voice cutting through Graham's rant like a blade. "That's not fraud prevention. That's destruction of legal tender." The room went quiet again. Even the whispers stopped. Derek shifted uncomfortably by the door, his training telling him that legitimate cashier's checks weren't something you just tore up, regardless of who was carrying them. Caleb straightened his shoulders, his eyes never leaving Graham's face. "Before you call the police, call your boss." The glass doors of First National Bank flew open with such force that they rattled against their frames. Marianne Bellamy strode through the entrance, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She wore a crisp navy blazer and carried herself with the kind of authority that came from 15 years of managing regional banking operations. Her face showed controlled irritation, the expression of someone who had been pulled away from important meetings to handle what she assumed was a routine customer complaint. The lobby was unusually tense for a Tuesday afternoon. Customers sat in uncomfortable silence, some still holding their phones, others pretending to read brochures while stealing glances toward the main counter. The college students by the ATMs had moved closer, clearly hoping to catch more drama on video. Even the security guard looked unsettled, shifting his weight from foot to foot near the entrance. Marianne's stride faltered when she saw the scene at the customer service counter. A black farmer in work clothes stood perfectly still beside the teller station, his weathered hands resting calmly at his sides. Torn pieces of what appeared to be a check lay scattered on the granite countertop. Graham Voss paced behind the counter like a caged animal, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled, his tie askew. But it was the farmer's face that made Marianne's stomach drop. Caleb Monroe. She recognized him from board meeting photographs, confidential shareholder reports, and the private files that only senior executives were allowed to access. He looked exactly as she remembered, quiet, dignified, unassuming, the kind of man who could walk into any room wearing farm clothes and be completely underestimated by everyone present. Graham rushed toward her, relief flooding his features. "Marianne, thank God you're here. This man tried to deposit a fake check for $2 million. When I called him out on it, he became aggressive and started making threats. I had to tear up the fraudulent document as evidence." Caleb remained silent, his dark eyes moving between Graham and Marianne with the patient observation of someone who had spent decades watching people reveal their true character under pressure. He made no attempt to defend himself, offer explanations, or interrupt Graham's version of events. He was disturbing other customers, Graham continued, gesturing toward the lobby, making wild claims about owning property, demanding special treatment. "I've handled situations like this before. These people think they can—" "Stop talking." Marianne's voice cut through Graham's explanation like ice. She moved closer to the counter, her eyes fixed on the torn check pieces. Even damaged, she could see enough of the routing numbers and bank logos to recognize a legitimate cashier's check from Farmers Trust Bank. Her gaze moved to Caleb's face, calm, watchful, but not surprised. This was not the expression of someone who had been caught in a lie. This was the expression of someone who had expected exactly what had happened. Graham looked confused by her reaction. "Marianne, we need to call security and have this man removed before—" "Mr. Monroe." Marianne's tone changed completely as she addressed Caleb directly. The irritation vanished, replaced by the careful respect that came with recognizing a serious mistake had been made. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for what has happened here today." The lobby fell silent. Graham's mouth opened, then closed. Customers leaned forward in their seats. Even Lillian behind the counter stopped pretending to work and stared openly at the unfolding scene. Caleb nodded slightly, but said nothing. His silence was more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. Marianne picked up the torn check pieces, examining them more carefully. Serial numbers, security features, official seals, everything indicated authenticity. She looked at Graham, whose confident expression was slowly cracking into confusion and dawning fear. "Graham," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent lobby, "he owns 40% of this bank." The bank lobby erupted into whispers the moment Marianne's words hung in the air. 40% ownership. The number hit customers like a physical blow, causing them to shift uncomfortably in their seats and exchange stunned glances. Some pulled out phones to text friends about what they were witnessing. Others simply stared, trying to process how badly they had misjudged the quiet farmer standing at the counter. Graham's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. Mr. Monroe, I had no idea. There's been a terrible misunderstanding here." His voice cracked slightly as he reached toward the torn check pieces. "I can fix this immediately. We'll process a replacement check, expedite everything through our priority services." Caleb looked at Graham's outstretched hand but made no move to shake it. His expression remained calm, almost studying, like he was watching an interesting but predictable animal behavior. "A misunderstanding," he repeated quietly, letting the words settle in the silent lobby. "Yes, exactly." Graham's relief was premature and desperate. These things happen in banking. Documentation gets mixed up, communication breaks down. I'll personally handle your account from now on. Whatever you need. "What I needed," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly across the marble floor, "was basic human respect. What I got was you calling me a fraud, tearing up my check, and threatening to have me arrested." He paused, letting Graham absorb each word. In front of all these people, Derek Hale stepped away from the door where he had been blocking Caleb's exit. The security chief's face showed embarrassment and growing anger as he realized how Graham had manipulated him. He had spent 15 minutes treating an innocent customer like a criminal because his manager had lied about the threat level. His jaw tightened as he looked at Graham with open disgust. "Sir," Derek said to Caleb, "I apologize for my part in this. I was given false information about the situation." Caleb nodded at Derek with something approaching approval. At least one person in the bank could recognize wrong and own it. Marianne stepped forward, her executive training kicking in as she tried to contain what was becoming a public relations disaster. "Mr. Monroe, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately in our conference room. I'm sure we can resolve everything quietly and to your complete satisfaction." Several customers groaned audibly at her suggestion. Evelyn Price, still holding her phone, shook her head in disapproval. The idea of moving this confrontation behind closed doors felt like another attempt to protect the bank's image rather than address what had actually happened. Caleb bent down and carefully gathered the torn pieces of his check, handling them like evidence in a court case. Each movement was deliberate and unhurried. He straightened slowly, the check fragments held carefully in his weathered hands. "All right," he said finally, "we can talk privately." But as he followed Marianne toward the hallway leading to the executive offices, Caleb paused and turned back to Graham. The bank manager was still standing behind the counter, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Mr. Voss," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly through the lobby, "this was never only about one check." The words sent a chill through the room. Graham's attempted smile faltered completely. There was something in Caleb's tone that suggested this confrontation was far from over, that the torn check was merely the beginning of a much larger reckoning. In the conference room, Marianne closed the door and gestured toward the polished mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. "Please, have a seat. Can I get you coffee? Water? I want to make sure we address every concern you might have." Caleb remained standing and placed a weathered manila folder on the conference table. The folder was thick, worn at the edges, and held together with a rubber band that had seen better days. It looked completely out of place in the pristine corporate environment. Marianne's executive smile flickered as she stared at the folder. Something about its appearance, the careful way Caleb handled it, the obvious age and use, suggested it contained more than simple banking documents. "Mr. Monroe, I want to assure you that what happened today was completely unacceptable. Graham's behavior was unprofessional and will be addressed through our disciplinary process. We'll also be implementing additional sensitivity training for all customer-facing staff." Caleb opened the folder carefully, revealing newspaper clippings, photocopied documents, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be bank statements from multiple accounts. The papers were organized with the methodical precision of someone who had spent considerable time building a case. "This contains records," Caleb said quietly, "of black farmers, elderly widows, and rural landowners who lost their property after strange account freezes, sudden loan reviews, and suspicious appraisals." He looked up at Marianne. "All connected to this bank." Marianne leaned forward, trying to read the documents from across the table. "I'm sure there must be reasonable explanations for any irregularities you've noticed. Banking regulations are complex, and sometimes legitimate business practices can appear suspicious to customers who aren't familiar with." Caleb lifted a section of handwritten notes covered in neat, feminine script. The pages were yellow with age, filled with dates, names, and detailed observations written in blue ink. "My wife died trying to prove what your bank was doing." The conference room fell silent except for the muted hum of the air conditioning system. Marianne stared at the handwritten notes in Caleb's weathered hands, her executive composure beginning to crack around the edges. Caleb carefully spread the first few pages across the polished mahogany table. Ruth's neat handwriting covered lined notebook paper, each entry dated and detailed with the precision of someone who understood that documentation would be crucial. "Ruth was a teacher for 37 years, Caleb said, his voice steady but weighted with grief. "She knew how to research, she knew how to keep records, and she knew when something wasn't right." He pointed to the first entry, dated 3 years earlier. "The Patterson family owned 80 acres next to our eastern boundary. Been farming that land since 1952. Never missed a payment in 40 years. Marianne leaned forward, reading Ruth's careful script. "Patterson payment received March 15th. Bank receipt 451. Payment marked late March 20th. No explanation provided when questioned." Ruth noticed the pattern after it happened to 3 neighboring families within 18 months, Caleb continued, turning to another page. "The Washingtons, the Jenkins family, the Pattersons, all black farming families, all with clean payment histories." His finger traced down Ruth's notes. Their payments were marked late, even when bank receipts showed they'd been made on time. Their land was undervalued during loan renewals. Appraisals came back 30–40% below market rate. Marianne's jaw tightened as she read the detailed entries. Each family's story followed a similar pattern: mysterious late fees, reduced credit limits, accelerated payment schedules, and finally foreclosure proceedings that moved through the courts with unusual speed. "Where exactly did your wife obtain these documents?" Marianne asked, her tone shifting from apologetic to cautious. Caleb turned another page, revealing photocopied bank statements and foreclosure notices. "Ruth gathered them before her illness worsened. Some came from the families themselves, some from public records, some from sources who were tired of watching good people lose everything they'd worked for." The next page showed a hand-drawn map of the county, with colored pencils marking the properties that had been foreclosed. A clear pattern emerged. The lost farms formed a corridor along the proposed highway expansion route. After foreclosure, the land was sold to development companies, Caleb said. Shell corporations with names like Sunrise Holdings and Mountain View Development. Ruth tracked the ownership chains. They all lead back to the same investors. Outside the conference room, Graham Voss paced near the teller stations, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Sweat had begun to show through his expensive shirt, despite the cool air conditioning. He approached Derek Hale, who was reviewing the lobby's security footage on his tablet. "We need to discuss the incident recording," Graham said, his voice low but urgent. Derek looked up from the screen, which showed clear footage of Graham tearing the check and pointing toward the door. "What about it?" "The footage needs to be edited. Customer privacy concerns? We should prepare a shorter clip that focuses on the resolution rather than the misunderstanding." Derek's finger paused over the tablet screen. "You want me to delete parts of the recording?" "Not delete. Edit for clarity. Remove the portions that might be taken out of context." Graham's voice carried a desperate edge. That old man was disruptive. He was causing a scene. The full footage doesn't show the complete picture. Derek saved the current file and closed the tablet without responding immediately. His years as a police officer had taught him to recognize when someone was asking him to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. "I'll need to think about the technical requirements," Derek said carefully. Meanwhile, the bank's public relations team had gathered in a smaller office down the hall. 3 employees huddled around a computer, drafting a statement that would minimize the day's events. First National Bank regrets a miscommunication that occurred during a routine customer interaction today. The matter has been resolved to the customer's satisfaction, and we remain committed to serving all members of our community with respect and professionalism. Back in the conference room, Marianne closed Ruth's folder and looked directly at Caleb. "Mr. Monroe, I understand your concerns, and I appreciate the thoroughness of your wife's research. However, I must warn you that making these accusations publicly could be damaging for everyone involved." Caleb met her gaze without blinking. His weathered hands rested calmly on the table, but his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had made his decision long ago. "Good. Damage tells the truth where silence failed." That afternoon, Marianne Bellamy stood in the bank's main lobby and addressed the remaining staff with carefully measured words. The marble floors still echoed with whispers from the morning's confrontation, and several customers had already called asking about the incident with the farmer. Effective immediately, Graham Voss has been placed on temporary administrative leave while we review today's events, Marianne announced. "All customer concerns will be directed to me personally until further notice." The tellers nodded, but their eyes kept drifting toward the hallway where Graham had retreated. He hadn't left the building. Instead, he had locked himself inside the back office that housed personnel files, loan records, and account histories. Marianne had given him access to gather his personal belongings, but the afternoon stretched on with no sign of him actually leaving. Behind the closed office door, Graham's hands shook as he dialed a number he had memorized but hoped never to use in desperation. The phone rang twice before a calm, controlled voice answered, "Victor Langford." "Victor, it's Graham. We have a problem." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for Graham to hear his own heartbeat. Victor Langford was not a man who appreciated problems, especially problems that threatened the carefully constructed network of shell companies, development partnerships, and land acquisitions that had made him wealthy. "Explain," Victor said finally. Graham's words tumbled out in a rush. "The Monroe situation. The old black farmer. He's not just some nobody trying to cash a fake check. He owns 40% of the bank's parent company. He has records. His dead wife was investigating us." Another pause. Graham could picture Victor in his glass-walled office overlooking the city, wearing one of his perfectly tailored suits, calculating risks with the same cold precision he applied to every business decision. "What kind of records?" Victor asked. "Land transfers, foreclosure timelines, the Washington farm, the Jenkins place, maybe others." Graham's voice cracked. "He knows about the corridor project. Then you need to control the situation before he starts connecting bank records to land acquisitions." Do whatever it takes. The line went dead. Graham stared at the phone, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He turned to his computer and began pulling account files, looking for anything that could be used to discredit Caleb Monroe before the old farmer destroyed everything. Meanwhile, 61-year-old Evelyn Price sat in her modest living room, uploading a video file to her social media accounts. She had taught school for 37 years, and those decades had taught her the power of evidence. Her phone had captured Graham's cruelest moments in perfect clarity. The contemptuous look when he saw Caleb's clothing, the deliberate destruction of the check, the finger pointed toward the door. She typed a simple caption. "This is how First National Bank treats its customers. Share this so it doesn't happen to someone else." Within an hour, the video had been shared 43 times. Within 2 hours, it reached 300 shares. Local residents who had banked at First National for decades watched Graham Voss humiliate an elderly farmer and recognized something familiar in the scene. The bank's phone began ringing. "This is exactly what happened to my grandmother," one caller told Lillian Brooks, the teller who had witnessed the morning's confrontation. "They treated her like she was stupid because she couldn't read the fine print." Another caller described how Graham had questioned her disability payments, demanding extra documentation and making her feel like a criminal for requesting assistance with paperwork. A third caller, an elderly man named Robert Hayes, said Graham had once accused him of lying about his military pension. "I thought it was just me," Hayes said. "I thought maybe I really was too old to understand modern banking." Lillian wrote down each complaint, her pen moving faster as the pattern became undeniable. Graham's behavior toward Caleb was not an isolated incident. It was a system. By late afternoon, Caleb Monroe walked out of the bank with Marianne's written promise that his business account would be fully restored by morning. The torn check would be replaced. An official apology would be drafted. The misunderstanding would be corrected. But Caleb knew the real fight was just beginning. The folder Ruth had left him contained more than just records of past victims. It contained names, dates, and connections that could destroy careers and send people to prison. Graham's humiliation had been the opening move, not the end game. Derek Hale waited until the building was nearly empty before returning to his security office. He pulled up the lobby footage again, watching Graham tear the check with deliberate malice. Then he inserted a blank USB drive into his computer and began copying the files. His police training had taught him that evidence could disappear when powerful people felt threatened. The original footage was stored on the bank's servers, where Graham or others could access it, but the copy on Derek's personal drive would be beyond their reach. As Caleb drove his pickup truck down the winding road toward Monroe Family Farms, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple. "Saw the video. My family lost our land the same way. Can we talk?" Then another message. "Graham did this to us too." And another, "We have documents." Back at the bank, Victor Langford's black sedan pulled into the executive parking area. He entered through the rear entrance and found Graham still hunched over computer files in the back office. Victor's silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit immaculate, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man accustomed to eliminating obstacles. "Show me what he has," Victor said without preamble. Graham pulled up account records, loan histories, and foreclosure documents. The evidence was damning, a clear pattern of targeted harassment against black landowners whose property sat along the proposed development corridor. Victor studied the screen in silence, his expression never changing. Finally, he turned to Graham with the same tone he might use to discuss weather conditions. "That old man knows too much." That evening, Caleb Monroe drove his weathered pickup truck up the gravel driveway to the farmhouse he had shared with Ruth for 42 years. The white clapboard siding needed paint, and the front porch sagged slightly where the support beam had settled, but the land stretched out behind it in neat rows of soybeans and corn that caught the last golden light of sunset. He parked beside Ruth's old garden, now overgrown with wild roses she had planted before her illness took hold. The silence felt heavy as he climbed the front steps, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of her lavender soap and the lemon oil she used to polish the kitchen table every Sunday. Caleb placed Ruth's folder beside the framed photograph that sat in the center of that same table. In the picture, Ruth smiled back at him with bright eyes and silver hair pulled into the neat bun she always wore to church. She had been 64 when the photo was taken, just 2 years before the cancer diagnosis that changed everything. "Well, Ruth," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her picture, "Graham showed his hand today, just like you said he would." He opened the folder and spread the documents across the table's surface. Bank statements, foreclosure notices, loan modification letters, and handwritten notes filled the space between him and Ruth's photograph. Her careful handwriting covered pages of observations, dates, and connections she had tracked over months of investigation. The Hawkins family lost 60 acres after a sudden loan review flagged their property as high risk. The bank's appraiser valued their land at 40% below market rate. 3 weeks later, a development company bought it at auction for the exact appraised amount. The Washington farm fell to foreclosure after the bank claimed their mortgage payments were consistently late, despite bank-stamped receipts proving otherwise. The family fought for 8 months before losing everything. A shell company called Meridian Holdings purchased their land 6 days later. Mrs. Eleanor Bishop, an 80-year-old widow, signed away her family's 100-year-old property after bank representatives told her the mortgage was in default and she faced immediate eviction. She died in a nursing home 8 months later. Meridian Holdings developed her land into a strip mall. Pattern after pattern emerged from Ruth's careful documentation. The victims were always elderly, always rural, and always black. The buyers were always shell companies with addresses that traced back to post office boxes and corporate law firms. Caleb had seen Ruth work on these files during her final months, when she was too weak to tend her garden but too stubborn to stop fighting for justice. He had assumed she was simply keeping records, documenting injustice so it could not be forgotten. He had not realized she was building a legal case. He reached for the manila envelope tucked behind the bank statements. Ruth's handwriting on the outside read, "Only when they show their hand." Inside, Caleb found something that made his breath catch in his throat. A detailed map showed the proposed River Valley Commercial Corridor, a massive development project stretching 15 miles along the highway. Colored sections marked different phases: retail centers, office complexes, residential subdivisions, and industrial zones. Every farm that had been foreclosed sat directly in the corridor's path. The Hawkins land was marked for a shopping complex. The Washington property showed plans for luxury condominiums. Mrs. Bishop's family farm was designated as the site for a regional medical center, and Monroe Family Farms sat at the corridor's geographic center, marked with a red star and the notation, "Key Acquisition, 847 acres." Caleb's hands trembled as he studied the map. The bank had not been making random mistakes or showing casual prejudice. It had been systematically identifying landowners whose property blocked a multi-million-dollar development project, then creating financial crises to force them off their land. His $2 million cashier's check suddenly made perfect sense. The payment had come from Riverside Development LLC, which the map showed as a subsidiary of Langford Group Holdings. Victor Langford's signature appeared at the bottom of the development proposal, along with architectural renderings and profit projections. But Caleb had not sold his entire farm to Riverside Development. He had sold only a narrow 15-acre strip along his eastern boundary, land that bordered the creek and flooded every spring. Worthless for farming, but apparently essential for the development company's access road. The buyers thought they had cornered him. Without that strip, Caleb's remaining land would be landlocked, forcing him to sell the rest at whatever price they offered. They believed an elderly farmer would have no choice but to accept their terms. They had not known about Ruth's investigation. They had not known about the bank shares she had quietly purchased over decades, building a position that made Caleb one of the institution's largest private investors. They had not known that every cruel word Graham spoke, every document he destroyed, every lie he told was being recorded and documented. Caleb spread the development map flat beside Ruth's photograph, comparing the planned corridor to her notes about foreclosed farms. The alignment was perfect. Every family that had lost land owned property directly in the development path. At the bottom of the map, written in Ruth's careful script, were 3 words that made everything clear. They planned this. He found Victor Langford's name printed at the bottom of the development agreement, along with his title, Chairman and CEO, Langford Group Holdings. The same man who sat on First National Bank's board of directors. The same man who had approved the suspicious loans that destroyed farming families. Caleb looked up at Ruth's photograph, her smile as patient and determined as it had been in life. She had spent her final months uncovering a conspiracy that stretched from bank offices to corporate boardrooms, a scheme designed to steal generational wealth from families who had farmed the same land for decades. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was undeniable. The connections were documented in Ruth's precise handwriting, backed by official records the conspirators thought would never be discovered. Caleb touched Ruth's picture gently, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet kitchen. "Ruth, you were right." The sky was still dark when Naomi Whitaker's sedan pulled into the gravel driveway of Monroe Family Farms. Caleb had been awake since 4, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with her files spread before him and a pot of coffee growing cold. He watched through the window as Naomi stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase and moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to early meetings and difficult conversations. Caleb opened the front door before she could knock. Naomi Whitaker was a sharp-featured woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a navy suit that looked professional even at 5:30 in the morning. Her eyes were alert and focused, the kind of attorney who built cases methodically and never accepted easy answers. "Mr. Monroe," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for calling me. I've been following your wife's work for longer than you might expect." They sat at the kitchen table while the first hints of dawn crept through the windows. Naomi opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked with Ruth's name. Caleb's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Ruth contacted me 6 months before she passed," Naomi explained. "She knew she was running out of time, and she wanted to ensure someone could continue her investigation if necessary. I've been reviewing the land records, the foreclosure patterns, and the development connections ever since." Caleb poured coffee for both of them, his movements careful and deliberate. "She never told me she had reached out to an attorney. She was protecting you," Naomi said gently. "Ruth knew that challenging people like Victor Langford and institutions like First National Bank would put you in danger. She wanted to gather all the evidence first, then strike when the case was bulletproof." Naomi spread out a series of property documents across the table. "Your land sale yesterday was recorded exactly as planned. You sold only the 15-acre strip along your eastern boundary to Riverside Development, LLC. The transaction gives them road access, but it also forces them to reveal their true ownership structure." She pointed to a highlighted section of the deed. "Riverside Development is controlled by Langford Holdings, which connects directly to Victor Langford's position on the bank board. By accepting their money, you've created a paper trail that proves the connection between the foreclosures and the development project." Caleb nodded slowly. "I kept the center acreage, the 800 acres they really need." "Exactly. They thought they were trapping you, but you trapped them instead." Naomi's smile was sharp and satisfied. "The partial sale forces them to negotiate for the remaining land, which means every conversation, every offer, every pressure tactic becomes evidence of their conspiracy." Caleb sipped his coffee, watching the sunrise paint the fields golden outside his window. "I brought that check to the bank to test Graham's branch. Ruth's files showed they had been targeting elderly farmers, but I needed to see if they would treat me the same way. And Graham performed perfectly," Naomi said with grim satisfaction. "He humiliated you in public, destroyed bank property, and demonstrated exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior Ruth documented. The lobby footage and witness testimony will be devastating in court. But Naomi's expression grew serious as she pulled out another set of documents. The problem is that Graham and Victor now know you have records. They know Ruth was investigating them. They know you're not just an isolated farmer they can intimidate and ignore. What does that mean for the case? It means they're going to fight back harder than before. Naomi leaned forward, her voice dropping to a warning tone. Banks have tools that individual farmers don't. They can freeze accounts, delay payments, create bureaucratic obstacles that starve your operation while keeping their hands technically clean. Caleb's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw a text message from his farm foreman, Miguel Santos. "Boss, the workers are here early, ready to start on the north field." "They're good men," Caleb said, standing to look out the window. "Miguel's been with me for 8 years. The others have families depending on this work." Naomi gathered her papers and closed her briefcase. "Be careful, Mr. Monroe. Yesterday you embarrassed Graham Voss in front of the entire bank. Today, he's going to try to make you pay for it." They walked outside together as the sun climbed higher, painting the farm buildings in warm light. Caleb could see his workers gathering near the equipment barn, checking tools and preparing for the day's harvest. Miguel waved from beside the combine harvester, and Caleb waved back. "How long before we can file formal charges?" Caleb asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I need to organize Ruth's evidence, connect it to the recent banking discrimination, and coordinate with federal regulators who handle institution-level fraud. Naomi paused beside her car. "Can you hold on that long?" "I've been holding on for months," Caleb replied. "I can handle whatever Graham thinks he can do to me." But as Naomi drove away, Caleb's phone rang with a call from First National Bank's automated system. The recorded message was brief and devastating. "Your business account has been placed under fraud review and temporarily frozen pending investigation. All automatic payments and transfers have been suspended." Caleb stared at the phone in his hand. Then he looked across the field where his workers were waiting, counting on their paychecks, trusting him to provide the work their families needed to survive. Graham Voss had just declared war on Monroe Family Farms. Caleb walked slowly toward the equipment shed where his crew waited beside the combine harvester and tractors. Miguel Santos looked up from checking the hydraulic lines, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw Caleb's expression. "Morning, boss," Miguel called. "The men are ready to start on the north field." Caleb stopped in front of the group. 7 workers stood around him, men who had been with Monroe Family Farms for years, men whose families depended on steady paychecks to keep food on their tables and rent paid. These were not seasonal laborers. They were his employees, his responsibility. "I need to tell you all something," Caleb said, his voice steady but carrying weight. "The bank froze our business account this morning. They're calling it a fraud review." Silence fell over the group. Roberto, Miguel's younger brother, shifted nervously. James, the newest hire, looked down at his boots. Miguel's jaw tightened. "What does that mean for us?" asked Thomas, who had 3 children at home. "It means payroll is delayed," Caleb said plainly. "The automatic deposit system is blocked. I cannot access the farm's operating account until the bank releases the freeze." Roberto stepped forward, worry clear in his voice. "How long will this take? My wife just had surgery. We need the insurance payments to go through." "Boss," James said quietly, "I was counting on this week's pay to cover my truck payment. If I miss it, they'll repossess." Caleb raised his hand, stopping the rising panic before it could spread. "Listen to me carefully. Every single person here will be paid. Every dollar you have earned, every benefit you are owed, every promise I made to you and your families will be kept." Miguel studied Caleb's face. "How?" "If the bank account is frozen, I have other resources," Caleb said, which was true. His personal accounts, his investment holdings, and his ownership stake in the bank's parent company gave him access to funds beyond the frozen farm account. "This freeze is not about fraud. It is about pressure. Someone wants to hurt me by hurting you." "So we keep working?" Thomas asked. "If you want to. The harvest does not stop because a bank manager is playing games." Caleb looked each man in the eye. but I understand if you need to look for other work until this is resolved. I will not hold it against anyone who cannot afford to wait." "We stay," Miguel said immediately. The others nodded agreement. "Then get the equipment ready. I have business to handle in town." An hour later, Caleb drove toward First National Bank with a car full of allies. Naomi sat in the passenger seat, reviewing legal documents. Behind them, Evelyn Price adjusted her glasses and checked her phone camera. 2 other passengers completed the group. Harold Washington, who lost his family's 40-acre farm to a suspicious foreclosure 3 years ago, and Dorothy Mills, whose late husband's land was seized after the bank claimed their insurance payments were never received. "They will try to separate us," Naomi warned as they approached the bank parking lot. "Banks hate public confrontations. They want to handle complaints privately where they can control the narrative." "Let them try," Evelyn said firmly. "I am done being quiet about what these people do." Inside the bank, Marianne Bellamy appeared quickly when the group approached the customer service desk. But instead of greeting them in the lobby, she gestured toward a hallway leading to the back offices. "Mr. Monroe, I think it would be better if we discussed your concerns privately." "No," Caleb said simply. "We stay here." Marianne's professional smile strained. "I understand your frustration, but this is a private financial matter." "Nothing about yesterday was private," Evelyn pointed out, her voice carrying the authority of a former principal. "Graham humiliated this man in front of everyone. Now, you want to hide the solution? Mrs. Price, I appreciate your concern, but my concern is that this bank has been cheating people for years," Harold interrupted, his anger barely controlled. "My family lost everything because of mysterious account problems that never got explained." Dorothy stepped forward, holding a folder of documents. "My husband paid that loan for 30 years, never missed a payment. Then the bank claimed we were in default and took our home." Marianne looked around the lobby, noticing other customers starting to watch the confrontation. "Please, let's handle this professionally. Mr. Monroe, I can have our legal department prepare a settlement offer that addresses your concerns." "What kind of settlement?" Naomi asked sharply. "A fair compensation package for yesterday's incident, along with a guarantee that it will not happen again." "In exchange for what?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. "A confidentiality agreement. No public statements about the bank or its employees. No social media posts. No interviews with reporters." "No," Caleb said immediately. "You want to pay me to be quiet about what Graham did. You want to pay me to ignore what happened to Harold and Dorothy and everyone else your bank cheated." Marianne's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Monroe, we are trying to resolve this reasonably. Reasonable would be admitting what your bank has been doing for years." Caleb's voice remained calm, but it carried the weight of absolute determination. "Reasonable would be investigating every suspicious foreclosure, every manipulated appraisal, every elderly farmer who lost land after dealing with Graham Voss." "That is not going to happen," Marianne said firmly. "Then we have nothing to discuss," Caleb replied, and led his group toward the exit. That evening, after a long day of harvest work and legal planning, Caleb returned to Monroe Family Farms as darkness settled over the fields. He parked near the farmhouse and walked toward the barn to check on some equipment before heading inside for dinner. The smell of smoke hit him before he saw the flames. Orange light flickered through the barn's side windows. Caleb ran toward the building, pulling out his phone to call the fire department. The main doors stood open, which was wrong. He never left the barn unlocked. Inside, smoke filled the air and small flames crackled in his office area. File cabinets stood open, their contents scattered across the floor. His desk drawers had been pulled out and emptied. Papers were everywhere, some still burning in a metal wastebasket that had been knocked over. Caleb grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed foam over the flames, choking back smoke as he worked to contain the damage. The fire was small, contained to the office corner, more about destroying evidence than burning down the building. When the flames were out, Caleb surveyed the destruction. Ruth's folder was gone. The maps, the loan documents, the handwritten notes she had spent months gathering, all missing. Copies of old appraisal reports had been burned. Her careful documentation of the bank's pattern of abuse had been systematically targeted. In the wreckage near his desk, Caleb found Ruth's photograph, the one he kept beside his computer. The glass was cracked, and smoke had darkened the edges of the picture, but her face was still visible, still watching him, with that determined expression he remembered so well. Caleb stood in the smoke-filled barn, holding the damaged photograph, believing that Ruth's original evidence was gone forever. The farmhouse kitchen felt smaller, with 4 people crowded around the old wooden table at 5 in the morning. Caleb sat hunched over a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, still wearing clothes that smelled of smoke from the barn. Dark circles under his eyes showed he had not slept after the fire department finished their work, and the sheriff took his statement about the break-in. Naomi Whitaker spread legal documents across the scarred table surface, while Evelyn Price poured fresh coffee for everyone. Derek Hale sat uncomfortably in a chair that seemed too small for his broad shoulders, still processing how completely Graham had lied to him about the lobby incident. "They took everything," Caleb said quietly, staring at the cracked photograph of Ruth that he had placed beside his coffee cup. "All of Ruth's work, all the proof she spent months gathering. It's gone." Naomi looked up from organizing papers and studied Caleb's face. She had seen clients lose hope before, but something about his defeated posture worried her. This was the first time since entering the bank that Caleb Monroe had looked truly shaken. "Caleb," she said carefully, "how well did you know your wife?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, did Ruth ever do anything halfway? Did she ever trust only one person to remember something important? Did she ever keep just one copy of anything that mattered?" Caleb's hands tightened around the coffee mug, his eyes focused on Ruth's photograph, remembering her careful nature, her stubborn thoroughness, her absolute refusal to let important things slip away. "She always said trust but verify," he murmured. "She never threw away receipts. She kept carbon copies of letters. She photographed important documents before putting them in files. And during her final months, when she was investigating the bank," Naomi continued, "did she change any of her habits?" Caleb closed his eyes, thinking back to Ruth's last year. She had grown more secretive, more careful. She spent hours organizing papers, mailing letters to herself, making copies of things he did not understand at the time. "She wore a key around her neck," he said suddenly, sitting up straighter. "A small brass key on a chain. She never took it off, not even in the hospital. I still have it upstairs." Evelyn leaned forward. "What did the key open?" "I never asked. Ruth said it was for something she would explain when the time was right." Caleb stood up abruptly and walked toward the pantry. "But she told me once that the most important things should be hidden where people look every day, but never really see." The pantry was narrow and deep, filled with shelves of canned goods, old jars, and kitchen supplies that had accumulated over decades. Caleb pulled out preserved vegetables, boxes of pasta, and containers of flour until he reached the back wall, behind a row of dusty mason jars filled with Ruth's pickled beets. His fingers found a metal box wedged into the corner. It was an old recipe box, the kind women used to keep index cards of family cooking instructions. The small brass lock matched the key Ruth had worn around her neck during her final months. Caleb carried the box back to the table, his hands steadier than they had been since the fire. He retrieved the key from upstairs and opened the lock. Inside, organized with Ruth's characteristic precision, were items that made everyone at the table go silent. Flash drives in labeled envelopes, certified copies of documents with official stamps, letters Ruth had mailed to herself, still sealed, preserving dates when she discovered various pieces of evidence, printed emails between bank officers, altered appraisal reports with the original and modified versions side by side, foreclosure timelines showing patterns of abuse spanning 5 years, and on top of everything, a handwritten note in Ruth's careful script, "For Caleb, when they think they have won." Derek whistled low. How much evidence did she gather? Naomi was already examining the documents. "This is more than we lost in the fire. This is a complete case file. Bank emails, financial records, corporate connections." She looked up at Caleb. "Your wife built a prosecutor's dream. There's more." Caleb said, pulling out a manila envelope marked Video Recordings. Inside were additional flash drives labeled with dates and locations. Ruth recorded conversations. She documented meetings. She preserved everything. Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out his own flash drive. Add this to the collection. Full lobby footage from yesterday. Every angle. Complete timeline. And I can testify that Graham specifically asked me to delete certain camera angles and replace the record with edited clips. Evelyn examined one of Ruth's letters, postmarked 3 months before her death. She mailed this evidence to herself to establish the date she discovered it. That's admissible in court. Your wife knew exactly what she was doing. Caleb spread Ruth's documents across the table, seeing names he recognized and connections he had not understood before. Graham Voss appeared in multiple email threads discussing problem accounts and acquisition opportunities. Victor Langford's development company received regular updates about vulnerable properties coming available through foreclosure. Senior bank officers who Caleb had never met were copied on messages about manipulating appraisal values and accelerating loan reviews for elderly farmers and minority landowners. They didn't just steal Ruth's folder, Caleb said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. They stole the visible evidence, while the real proof was hidden right here in our kitchen. Naomi smiled grimly. They played right into her trap. Caleb looked at Ruth's evidence spread across the table where she had eaten breakfast every morning for 40 years. The stolen folder had been bait, designed to make the bank believe they had destroyed the proof, while the real archive waited safely behind pickled beets and preserves. Now we let them walk into the room thinking they already won. The upstairs boardroom of First National Bank smelled like leather and old money. Heavy wooden chairs surrounded a polished conference table that reflected the morning light streaming through tall windows. Board members filed in quietly, their faces serious as they prepared for what Victor Langford had called an emergency shareholder protection meeting. Victor sat at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled and his dark suit expensive enough to buy a small farm. He had flown in from the state capitol that morning, telling the board that Caleb Monroe represented a threat to the bank's stability and reputation. His briefcase contained legal documents designed to limit Caleb's voting power through emergency bylaw changes. We cannot allow one disgruntled customer to destroy this institution, Victor told the assembled board members. Monroe is clearly unstable. He made wild accusations yesterday, disrupted normal banking operations, and now he's encouraging other customers to spread false stories online. Board member Patricia Wells shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had seen Evelyn's video and watched Graham tear up a legitimate check in front of witnesses. Victor, shouldn't we investigate his claims before we restrict his ownership rights? There's nothing to investigate, Victor replied smoothly. A confused old man brought in suspicious paperwork and became belligerent when staff followed proper fraud prevention procedures. Graham Voss acted professionally under pressure. Graham nodded from his seat near the window, his confidence restored after the barn fire. Exactly. Monroe threatened the staff, disrupted other customers, and refused to accept that his check required additional verification. When we tried to handle it quietly, he started making accusations about conspiracy and discrimination. Marianne Bellamy sat at the opposite end of the table, her fingers drumming nervously against her leather portfolio. She had spent the night reviewing Caleb's ownership documentation and the bank's legal obligations to major shareholders. We should delay this vote. Monroe has significant ownership rights that cannot be altered without proper notice, and the notice period was waived under emergency provisions, Victor interrupted. This board has the authority to protect the institution from shareholder actions that threaten operational stability. But he owns 40% of the parent company, Marianne insisted. We cannot simply— We can and we will, Victor said firmly. The emergency bylaws are clear. When a shareholder engages in activities that damage the bank's reputation or interfere with normal operations, the board may suspend their voting privileges pending a full review. Through the tall windows, the board members could see the lobby below filling with people. Cars pulled up outside the bank throughout the morning, as word spread through the community about Evelyn's video and Graham's treatment of Caleb. Former customers arrived carrying old foreclosure notices, payment receipts, and account statements that showed suspicious patterns of manipulation. "Look at that crowd," board member Robert Hayes said, gesturing toward the window. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Monroe has stirred up the entire town with his false accusations." "Those are our customers down there," Marianne said quietly. "People who have banked here for decades. Maybe we should listen to what they're saying." Victor's jaw tightened. They're listening to an old man who cannot accept that his paperwork was questionable. Graham showed appropriate caution. Now Monroe is trying to turn a routine security check into some kind of discrimination case. Graham leaned forward in his chair. The evidence of his fraud attempt burned in that convenient barn fire. Now he's trying to use his ownership stake to intimidate us instead of facing the consequences of his actions. The lobby below had grown crowded with people who normally would never gather at a bank on a weekday morning. Elderly farmers stood beside retired teachers and shop owners, many holding documents and speaking in quiet, angry voices about their own experiences with sudden account reviews, manipulated loan terms, and mysterious appraisal problems. Marianne watched the crowd through the window and felt her stomach tighten. "Victor, if we restrict Monroe's shareholder rights without proper investigation, and he's telling the truth about systematic abuse—" "He's not telling the truth," Victor snapped. "He's a bitter old man who tried to pass a fraudulent check and got caught. The barn fire destroyed his fake evidence before anyone could examine it properly. Now he's using emotional manipulation and racial grievance to avoid accountability." The boardroom door opened, and Secretary Linda Walsh stepped inside, nervously. "Excuse me, Mr. Langford, but there's a large group requesting access to this meeting. They're downstairs with Mr. Monroe." Victor smiled coldly. "Tell them this is a private board meeting. If Monroe wants to file a formal complaint, he can schedule an appointment through proper channels." "Sir, they're not leaving. There are reporters outside now, too." Graham's confidence flickered slightly, but Victor remained calm. "Let them make noise in the lobby. We'll handle this legally and professionally, which is more than Monroe deserves after his behavior yesterday." The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the boardroom. Multiple people were climbing the stairs, their voices low but determined. Board members turned toward the door as the footsteps grew closer. "They wouldn't dare interrupt a board meeting," Hayes muttered. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Then came a firm knock. Victor straightened his tie and smiled. "Come in." The door opened, and Caleb Monroe stepped into the boardroom wearing the same faded red flannel shirt, worn jeans, muddy boots, and straw hat that had caused Graham to judge him so harshly the day before. His calm eyes surveyed the table, taking in each face before settling on Victor. Behind Caleb came Naomi Whitaker, carrying a leather briefcase and a determined expression. Evelyn Price followed with her phone ready to record. Derek Hale entered next, no longer wearing his bank security uniform. Several elderly black farmers and 2 widows carrying foreclosure documents filed in after them, filling the boardroom with people who had never been invited upstairs before. Graham saw Caleb enter and felt his confidence return completely. The old farmer had no evidence left, no legal standing, and no way to prove his wild accusations. Graham leaned back in his chair and smirked at Caleb. "You should have stayed on your farm." Caleb Monroe walked to the head of the boardroom table with the same steady pace he used crossing his fields each morning. His muddy boots left faint prints on the polished floor. His straw hat cast a shadow over his weathered face. He looked around the table at each board member, then at Victor Langford, then at Graham Voss, who was still smirking. "Gentlemen, ladies," Caleb said quietly, "I believe we have some business to discuss." Victor slammed his hand on the table. "This is a private board meeting. You have no right to bring these people in here and disrupt our proceedings. Security, remove them immediately." "I am security," Derek said from his position near the door, "and I'm not removing anyone until we all see what really happened yesterday." Victor's face reddened. "Monroe, Your attempt to damage this bank's reputation with false accusations ends now. You will face criminal charges for fraud, intimidation, and defamation. These people you've brought with you are trespassing. Caleb reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small recording device. He set it on the polished table where everyone could see it. Before we talk about reputation, let's watch what your manager did to mine. Evelyn stepped forward and connected her phone to the boardroom's wall monitor. The screen flickered, then showed Graham Voss standing behind the bank counter with Caleb's $2 million check in his hands. The audio was clear enough for every board member to hear. Graham's voice filled the room. This check is fake. You picked the wrong bank to try this. People like you think you can walk in here and embarrass us with your games. Board member Robert Hayes shifted uncomfortably as Graham's voice grew louder on the recording. The video showed Caleb asking politely for verification while Graham mocked his clothes, his farming background, and his right to be inside the bank. Then came the moment that made several board members gasp. Graham held the $2 million cashier's check high above his head and tore it cleanly in half, dropping the pieces on the counter like garbage. "Get out of my bank!" Graham shouted on the recording. The boardroom went silent except for the sound of Graham's recorded voice echoing off the walls. The real Graham sat frozen in his chair, watching his career destroy itself on the monitor. "That was taken out of context," Graham said desperately. "He was being aggressive. He was making threats. The security footage will show—" "Actually, it won't," Derek interrupted. He stepped forward with his own tablet. "Because you asked me to edit the security footage yesterday. You wanted me to cut out the parts that showed you humiliating Mr. Monroe without cause." Derek connected his tablet to the monitor, replacing Evelyn's phone. Now the boardroom watched the full security camera footage from multiple angles. It showed Caleb entering the bank calmly, approaching the counter politely, and standing perfectly still, while Graham berated him. At no point did Caleb raise his voice, make threats, or act aggressively. "I saved the complete footage before you could destroy it," Derek said to Graham. "Every camera angle, every minute. Mr. Monroe never did anything wrong." Graham's face went pale. "I was under stress. The check amount was suspicious. I made a judgment call to protect the bank from potential fraud." "You made a judgment based on his clothes and his skin color," Evelyn said sharply from across the room. "We all saw it. We all heard it." Victor stood up abruptly. "Enough of this circus. Even if Graham made an error in judgment, that does not justify Monroe's campaign to destroy this institution with wild conspiracy theories about land theft and systematic discrimination." Caleb opened his worn folder and nodded to Naomi. She moved around the table, placing thick document packets in front of each board member. The papers contained bank emails, altered property appraisals, foreclosure timelines, and loan modification records going back 5 years. "These are not conspiracy theories," Naomi said professionally. "These are bank records obtained through legal channels, showing systematic targeting of elderly black landowners for account manipulation, property undervaluation, and forced foreclosure." Board member Janet Crawford opened her packet and immediately found her own signature on several questionable appraisal approvals. "I don't remember authorizing these property values. Some of these numbers are 30% below market rate. That's because the appraisals were altered after you signed them," Caleb said. "The original documents showed different values. The modified versions were used to justify loan defaults and foreclosures." Marianne Bellamy felt her stomach drop as she recognized internal memos with her signature recommending enhanced scrutiny for rural farming accounts. She had signed them thinking they were routine risk assessments, not knowing they were being used to target specific families. "Victor, what is Langford Development's connection to these foreclosed properties?" Marianne asked, her voice tight with growing concern. Victor's calm mask began slipping. "I am a legitimate businessman who acquires distressed properties through legal channels. If some of those properties happen to be former bank customers, that's a coincidence, not a conspiracy." The door opened again, and 3 more elderly farmers entered carrying folders of their own. Behind them came 2 widows whose husbands had lost family land before their deaths. They spread foreclosure notices, payment receipts, and property maps across the boardroom table. "Mrs. Sarah Thompson, Riverside Farm," the first woman said, pointing to a circled area on Victor's development map. "Forced foreclosure 18 months ago after mysterious late payment penalties. Sold to Langford Development 2 weeks later for $30,000. Now worth $400,000 as commercial frontage. James Washington, Washington Family Produce," one of the farmers added, placing his finger on another circled property. "Account frozen during harvest season. Missed one payment due to the freeze. Foreclosure completed in 90 days. Property sold to Langford Shell Company for $50,000. Market value was $200,000. Each former landowner identified their lost property on Victor's development maps, creating a pattern too obvious for any board member to ignore. The same bank branch had created problems for black farming families. The same appraisers had undervalued their land, and the same development companies had purchased the foreclosed properties at fraction of their worth. Victor stood up sharply, his face red with anger. "This board will not be manipulated by emotional theater and selective document presentation. These people signed legal contracts. If they couldn't meet their obligations, that's not the bank's fault." Caleb reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out 2 torn pieces of paper. He placed them carefully beside Victor's development map, right next to the circled properties that had once belonged to the families standing around the table. The torn pieces were the $2 million cashier's check that Graham had destroyed in front of the entire bank lobby. Caleb looked directly at Victor, then at Graham, then back at Victor. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent boardroom. "You tore up the wrong man's check." The boardroom door burst open as footsteps echoed up the staircase. 3 men in dark suits entered, followed by a woman with a press badge and camera equipment. Behind them came 2 uniformed police officers who positioned themselves near the doorway. "Federal Banking Commission," the lead investigator announced, showing his badge to the room. "We're here following formal complaints filed this morning regarding systematic lending discrimination and property fraud involving this institution." Naomi stepped forward professionally. "Agent Morrison, thank you for responding so quickly. I filed the initial report at 7 this morning after my client provided evidence of coordinated efforts to target elderly minority landowners for fraudulent foreclosure." Graham's face went white. He pushed back from the table and moved toward the side hallway that led to the employee exit. "I need to check on branch operations downstairs." Derek Hale stepped directly into Graham's path, blocking the hallway entrance. "No, sir. You need to stay right here." "Get out of my way, Derek. You work for me." "Not anymore," Derek said, pulling a small flash drive from his jacket pocket. He handed it to Agent Morrison. "Full security footage from yesterday's lobby incident, plus recorded conversations where Mr. Voss asked me to delete portions of the video and replace them with edited versions that would make the customer look threatening." Graham lunged toward Derek, but one of the police officers moved between them. "Sir, step back and remain calm." Victor Langford stood up abruptly, grabbing his briefcase and coat. "I have no official connection to this bank's internal operations. I'm simply a concerned community investor who—" "Mr. Langford," Naomi interrupted, opening her own briefcase and removing a thick stack of documents. "These are signed purchase agreements, property transfer records, and shell company formations linking Langford Development directly to every foreclosed farm on your development map. Your signature appears on acquisition documents dated within weeks of each foreclosure completion." Victor's confident demeanor cracked. "Those are legal business transactions. There's nothing improper about purchasing available properties through proper channels. Available properties that became available through manipulated loan reviews, altered appraisals, and coordinated account freezes," Agent Morrison said, accepting the documents from Naomi. "We'll be examining every transaction between your development companies and properties formerly owned by the customers in this room." The reporter stepped forward with her camera rolling. "Mr. Voss, can you comment on allegations that you systematically targeted black farmers for account harassment and fraudulent foreclosure proceedings?" Graham backed against the wall, I don't have to answer questions from the media. This is a private business matter." Marianne Bellamy looked around the boardroom, seeing board members studying the evidence packets, investigators taking notes, police officers watching Graham, and customers from the lobby crowding around the doorway. The bank's reputation was collapsing in real time, broadcast live to the community. She stood up slowly and addressed Agent Morrison directly. "The First National Bank Board will provide full cooperation with your investigation. We will turn over all requested records, suspend implicated employees pending review, and establish an independent oversight committee to examine our lending practices." Victor slammed his briefcase shut. "Marianne, you're making a serious mistake. This bank has powerful friends who won't appreciate being thrown under the bus to protect some disgruntled farmers with victim complexes." Caleb Monroe rose from his chair at the head of the table. He had remained silent through most of the chaos, but now his quiet voice commanded attention from everyone in the room. "As the holder of 40% ownership in this bank's parent company," Caleb said formally, "I am calling for an immediate emergency vote to remove Graham Voss from all positions effective today, freeze all accounts connected to Langford Development pending investigation, and suspend any officers found to have participated in the documented fraud." Board member Janet Crawford nodded quickly. "I second the motion." "All in favor?" Marianne asked, knowing she had no choice. Every board member except Victor raised their hand. "Motion carries unanimously," Marianne announced. "Graham Voss, you are terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building." Graham's face twisted with rage and desperation. "You can't do this to me. I built this branch. I brought in millions in development partnerships. These people are nobody. They're farmers and widows, and they're customers you defrauded," Agent Morrison said firmly. "Officers, please escort Mr. Voss downstairs and ensure he doesn't access any computer systems or files on his way out." The police officers moved to either side of Graham. One of them spoke quietly. "Sir, you need to come with us now." Graham looked around the room wildly, seeing no allies left. Victor had already grabbed his coat and was heading for the door. Marianne avoided eye contact. The board members were studying the evidence packets with growing horror. As the officers guided Graham toward the stairs, he turned back toward Caleb with pure hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over, old man. You have no idea what you've started." Caleb met Graham's stare without flinching. "I know exactly what I started. Justice." The group moved downstairs into the main bank lobby, where dozens of customers had gathered after seeing the morning news reports. The same counter where Graham had torn Caleb's check yesterday was now surrounded by people holding their phones, recording everything. Derek walked behind Graham, making sure he couldn't access any computer terminals or grab documents from his office. The reporter followed with her camera, documenting Graham's walk of shame past the tellers he had supervised, the customers he had served, and the counter where he had humiliated a man he thought was powerless. Graham kept his head down as the police officers guided him through the lobby, past the same spot where he had waved Caleb's torn check in the air and declared it fake. His polished black suit and perfect tie looked ridiculous now, like a costume that no longer fit the role he had been playing. As Graham reached the front doors, escorted by police with federal investigators and reporters documenting every step, the crowd of customers began to clap. It started quietly, just a few people, but spread through the lobby until nearly everyone was applauding. Caleb stood near the torn check counter, still wearing his faded red flannel shirt and straw hat, watching the man who had tried to humiliate him get led away in front of the entire community. The same customers who had watched Graham tear up his check yesterday were now witnessing Graham's complete downfall. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of First National Bank as Caleb Monroe pushed through the glass doors at exactly 9 o'clock. This time, he was not alone. Attorney Naomi Whitaker walked beside him, carrying a leather briefcase filled with legal documents that would reshape how the bank operated forever. The lobby looked the same as it had 2 days ago, but everything felt different. The same tellers worked behind the same counter, but they looked up with respect instead of suspicion when they saw Caleb approach in his faded red flannel shirt and worn straw hat. The same customers sat in the same chairs, but now they nodded politely instead of staring with judgment. Marianne Bellamy was waiting at the main counter, not hidden away in a private conference room. She wore a conservative navy suit and carried herself with the careful dignity of a woman who knew her career depended on how the next 30 minutes went. "Mr. Monroe," Marianne said formally, extending her hand, "thank you for coming in this morning. I believe we have several matters to finalize." Caleb shook her hand but did not smile. "We do. Let's start with the check your manager tore up." Marianne nodded to Lillian Brooks, the teller who had first called Graham 2 days ago. Lillian placed a new cashier's check on the counter for exactly $2 million, made out to Monroe Family Farms. "This replaces the check that was improperly destroyed," Marianne explained. "All Monroe Family Farms accounts have been fully restored with no restrictions. The fraud review has been officially canceled and removed from your records." Caleb examined the check, then looked up at Marianne. "That's the easy part. Now we talk about the families your bank cheated." Naomi opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document. "The Ruth Monroe Rural Justice Fund," she announced, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "Funded by bank restitution and recovered development proceeds, administered independently, dedicated to reopening foreclosure cases and compensating victims of predatory lending practices." Marianne's jaw tightened, but she had no choice. The board had already voted. The regulators were watching. The reporters were still calling every hour. "The bank agrees to contribute $5 million immediately," Marianne said, reading from her own prepared statement. "We will also surrender all proceeds from properties that were improperly foreclosed, estimated at an additional $12 million once the Langford development assets are liquidated." A murmur went through the lobby. Customers who had been standing quietly began whispering to each other. Several elderly people started crying, remembering family land they thought was lost forever. Caleb placed his hand on the counter where Graham had torn his check. "Every family that lost property through account manipulation, false late payments, or suspicious appraisals gets their case reviewed. Every property that was undervalued during foreclosure gets a new independent assessment. Every family that was cheated gets compensation." "Agreed," Marianne said. "The fund will be overseen by a 3-person board, including 1 representative chosen by affected families, 1 independent banking expert, and 1 community leader." Naomi handed Marianne a pen. "Sign here to make it official." As Marianne signed the documents creating the Ruth Monroe Rural Justice Fund, Caleb thought about his late wife sitting at their kitchen table, carefully documenting every injustice she could find. Ruth had died believing the truth might never come out. Now her name would be on the fund that made things right. "There's one more thing," Caleb said quietly. "Graham Voss." Marianne's expression hardened. "Mr. Voss has been terminated and will face criminal referral for fraud, evidence tampering, and retaliation. The FBI and State Banking Commission have opened formal investigations. And Victor Langford? His development project has been suspended. Federal regulators seized all records yesterday. His company's bank accounts are frozen pending investigation." Caleb nodded slowly. The man who had tried to steal his land and the manager who had humiliated him were both facing justice. More importantly, the system that had protected them was being dismantled piece by piece. "My family's farm?" Caleb asked. Naomi smiled for the first time that morning. "Protected under an irrevocable family trust. No bank, no developer, no government agency can pressure you to sell. The land stays with your family forever." Marianne finished signing the last document and looked up at Caleb. "Mr. Monroe, I want to personally apologize for how you were treated in this bank. What happened to you was inexcusable." Caleb studied her face, looking for sincerity. "The apology I need isn't for me. It's for Ruth, and for every family that lost their land because your people thought rural folks couldn't fight back." "You have it," Marianne said. "The bank will issue public apologies to every affected family, and we're implementing new oversight procedures to ensure this never happens again. Caleb picked up his new check and folded it carefully into his shirt pocket, the same pocket where he had carried the original check that Graham destroyed. Justice had a strange way of coming full circle. As Caleb and Naomi walked toward the front doors, Caleb noticed something new mounted on the wall beside the customer service desk, a small brass plaque, freshly installed, that read, "The Ruth Monroe Rural Justice Fund, Protecting Family Farms and Rural Communities." Caleb stopped and placed his weathered hand over his heart, the same gesture he had made at Ruth's funeral. She would have been proud to see her name honored in the same building where they had tried to silence her truth. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the morning sunlight, still wearing his faded flannel shirt and straw hat, walking away from the bank that had tried to shame him and toward the farm that would now be protected forever. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.